for you to come out this afternoon. I'm Jonathan Simon. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Law and Society, one of the co-sponsors for today's event. I'm really pleased to get this discussion going, so I'm not going to impede it long. I want to turn to some thanks. To me, those are never formalities. To thank people is to be in a state of grace, and that's always a good thing. So I'd like to thank Jane Malden, who's the acting director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, who's the other co-sponsoring organization for today's event. And I would like to thank Roseanne Greenspan and Christine Trost of those respective centers for doing the actual organizing. And I'd like to thank Michael Musino for connecting us to Doran and this important book. So nobody here needs reminding that over the last 30 years, we have incarcerated hundreds of thousands of Americans. And you probably also know that during that same time, a great darkness has fallen over our knowledge of what the experience of imprisonment is like. And while many of us, including this guy, claim to make a living as experts on mass incarceration, very few of us know, who have not been inside prisons as prisoners, can know much of the truth of that experience. And that's why writers are so incredibly important. And prison writers across time have brought the prison to our attention. But in our recent era, it seemed, at least when I looked at it in the 90s, as if that powerful discourse had largely fallen silent for various reasons. And I'm delighted that in some ways today, much belatedly, we are in the midst of, in some ways, a renaissance of prisoner writing, or at least that writing reaching audiences. And this book is very much part of that. So the plan is that I'm going to, after I introduce Doran Larson, who has edited this collection, he will speak for about 30 minutes or so about it. And then I'm very delighted that I'll have Professor Pat Hilden and myself. Well, I'm very delighted that she is here to offer some comments, and I will also offer some comments as well. So let me tell you a little bit about Doran. He is an English professor at Hamilton College in New York. He's a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. As I just learned, he has spent time in the Bay Area, not at Berkeley, but at Mose, a much more important learning institution. At Hamilton, he's also been, and really nationally, I think one of the figures leading the sort of movement to engage prison writers inside and outside. And he has led the Attica Writers Workshop at Attica since 2006. He's the founder of 2 college in prison programs, the Attica Genesee Teaching Project, which began delivering college credit courses inside Attica in January 2011, and the Mohawk Consortium College and Prison Program, which has just started at Mohawk this January. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Doran to come up here and I guess stand here so he can be seen on our video as well. And then I'll come up afterwards to introduce Pat and to also engage you and your questions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Doran Larson to Berkeley.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to all the folks that he named, Roseanne Greenspan, Michael Musino, Christine Trost, and the Center for the Study of Law and Society, and the other institutes that were involved in putting this together. There's a lot more work than anybody can imagine in putting an event like this together. I appreciate all of you coming out. I've been doing presentations on this book and the digital archive that I'll talk about in prisons, in bookstores, and at universities. This is a talk the way I'm putting it together today, which is sort of aimed at this audience. I hope you find something here for everyone. So I'm going to talk about 2 attempts to place the voices of incarcerated Americans at the center of a national and what has become really an international conversation about the sources and effects and the possible paths back down from the unprecedented scale of incarceration in the United States. I'll talk first about the book and then about the digital archive. My generic claim, based on the canon of American prison writing and reading hundreds of essays from currently incarcerated Americans, is that there is a vital need for a radical paradigm shift in our conception of the prison population, a shift that I believe only prison witness can force. This is a shift toward viewing mass incarceration not only as a civil and human rights issue, which it's not seen as today, it's simply seen as a dollars and cents issue for the most part, or only towards seeing imprisoned people as a criminal justice or social welfare problem, but to a conception of the imprisoned as an untapped resource. That is to say, as our primary source and insight into the structural relationships between poverty and crime, prisons, addiction, gender identification, race, class, judicial, and public policy. What Fourth City and the American and respectful recognition of the social, the intellectual, and indeed the profound moral capital that's currently locked up inside our prisons. Now, this is claimed based on two further claims. One is fairly modest, I would say, though it may sound striking, and the other qualitative. The first quantitative and the other qualitative. First, a witness literature is in the making right now that is one of the largest witness literatures ever amassed. A literary corpus already many times larger than the entire canon of the witness born from American slavery and from Native genocide. Second, this is an American literature with a potential to teach us as much and potentially even more, I believe, about our commitment as a nation to an unbroken history of subjugation of people of color, about the practice of law, and about law's foundation in collectively organized human suffering than the witness that came from slavery and Native genocide, since this is not only an ongoing, a living, and a peculiarly American witness built on American ideas of justice, but one born from an institution that is at once normalized and erased from legal discourse, a nearly complete exception to the rule of law for poor people of color. What I believe this and such literatures can teach us is the limits of the suffering we can afford to tolerate under the cover of law. The social cost of meting out such suffering on a mass scale and what it means to understand what it is, that it is upon collectively organized mass-scale suffering that our very sense of law and legal order rests. Glossing Carl Schmitt, Walter Benjamin, and Giorgio Agamben on the founding of law and nation not in the practice but in the exception to law, my claim is simply that the U.S. prison today is the normalized exception and that the exception speaks. It is spoken, and it speaks today, and if we are to understand the nation and the legal culture that we are, we have to listen. Though in obvious ways the witness borne by convicted persons is different from that borne by people who suffered for what they were rather than what they've done, that is to say black or Native Americans, rather than for what they've done, I hope to show first that the distinction is more apparent than real, and that we all have a profound stake in the dissemination and preservation of the witness emerging now from the American prison. I'm going to step back, and for many people in this room, this is not going to be news, but I'm going to set up some sort of grounding facts, which I think will help set the context for appreciating the two projects. As most of us here know, America is the most incarcerated people in the world. The only nations that come close to our levels of incarceration are exactly those nations that we typically criticize for human rights violations. And the countries that we might like to think ourselves compared to are way behind in terms of their rates of incarceration. Within an American context, the prison and jail population at 2.2, and that's a modest number, it should be higher, is the fourth largest community. And I'm going to push this idea of the city not simply as a metaphor or a matter of numbers, but as a way of better qualitatively understanding what the nature of that experience is. All right. Adding persons under custodial supervision, we get to 7 million add their incarcerated children to be incarcerated, and 9.5, the largest metropolitan area in the nation. And as we also know, this is not a result of high rates of crime. It's a result of high rates of incarceration, which are a separate thing and really always have been a separate thing from rates of crime. This is a chart from 1970 up to 2006. And you'll see the crime rate varies, and then it starts to drop precipitously. In the 1990s, the best explanations for those is basically a demographic shift. This is a global drop, all right? It's not just American. There's a drop in crime rates all over the world, and it's largely a drop in the cohort of men between their teens and their mid-20s. There was just a drop-off at that point, all right? And crime rates have gone down around the world. Another number of other factors that people point to as well. But of course, the incarceration rate continues to go up. This chart, of course, is not updated since, remember, I showed you 748 per 100,000, so you have to go down to 50% higher than this, at least, all right, to show where we are today, where the crime rate has continued to drop. There have been little blips, but it's gotten back to that sort of normal range, what is, in fact, a normal range for the U.S. At this point. So how do we get to this point? And how do we have a large prison population without high crime rates? In the early 70s, most experts believed that prisons were going to cease to exist. Everybody knew that they didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't reduce crime. They didn't discourage criminal lifestyles. They tended to institutionalize them. And we knew that other sort of social institutions dealt with the problems associated with crime better. Mental health, probation, parole, a whole set of other remedies. And then Richard Nixon, and this really starts in terms of the actual rhetoric, 64 with Goldwater's presidential campaign, the Law and Order campaign, right? And what it was what Ian Lopez has called dog whistle politics. That is to say, it was code because segregation was now unconstitutional, all right? You couldn't use that word anymore, but you could use law and order as a way of sending signals to white voters that we're going to clamp down on all that urban unrest. But there was a lack of discrimination between urban unrest, meaning civil disobedience, black empowerment, or actual rioting, right, street crime. And then the war on drugs, of course, effectively federalized and militarized local police units that targeted people of color. And the way that worked was that the federal government, and I'm a little self-conscious talking about this with Jonathan Simon in the room because I'm basically sort of, channeling Jonathan Simon's reading of this and a number of other people. I hope he'll approve of the basic reading here. What they said to local police agencies is no matter what your primary crime problems are, those could be domestic violence, they could be burglary, they can be murder, but if you make drug arrests your priority, federal money will come to you and federal equipment will come to you. And I'm old enough to remember when the police did not look like an occupying paramilitary force, all right? They were the folks that, you lived with, all right? And then, of course, also in the 80s to the present, deregulation facilitated corporate flight from inner cities, taking unionized manufacturing jobs overseas. This is also, Bruce Western does a beautiful reading in Punishment and Inequality, in which he very simply goes back and he reads the prison population back into the unemployment rate, which we don't normally count, all right? And then looks at what does that history actually look like. So you have this political focus on the inner cities. You have the basically the rubric for policing those areas under the law, the war on drugs, and then you have an employment vacuum. All right, so this is the setup, for this transformation, and this all fits into what Louis Laquant talks about the transition from the welfare state to the penal state. We no longer provide those sort of safety nets for people who are the casualties of corporate flight. Instead, we round up and lock them up and put them in prisons, right, and create another industry out of that. The result of this is what I've called in print American apartheid or penal apartheid, in which few middle-class whites know anyone who's actually served time in prison. And it's very hard to find a black person in America of any class who does not know someone personally who's been in prison. To me, that spells apartheid. And I'm also in the question and answer be happy to talk about why I think that's a different reading of this history and a necessary complement to Michelle Alexander's reading of New Jim Crow. All right, this is basically, to my mind, I'm coming to this as a white person. What I'm looking at is the sort of bubble of protection that white affluent people live in, as opposed to that lockdown state that Michelle Alexander points out that exists for other folks. So convict status, as Bruce Western observed in 2006, adheres now not in individual offenders, but in entire demographic categories. And you can see how this starts to level out that moral distinction we make between those who are the victims of native genocide and slavery, people who suffered for what they were, as opposed to for what they have done. All right. But what do I mean by calling this a city? Important to know that I do not mean this metaphorically. I mean this quite literally. What the essays submitted to the book and the archive make clear is that we can think of the prison quite literally as a mass-scale metropolis. That whether experienced in West Virginia or Oregon, Missouri, or Minnesota, living in the prison is a cohesive and particular an experience as living in New York, LA, and Chicago, and in many ways more cohesive, since free people can experience those cities in any ways that they want, whereas unfree people experience this metropolis in this particular kind of way. So why is it hard for us to get our heads around that idea of this not just being sort of generic spaces with generic bodies inside of it? One of the reasons is that despite the fact that this fourth city, unlike any other nation, is largely an invention of politics and public policy, and despite the fact that Americans are absolutely obsessed with criminal justice, a first day practice exercise I give my students in my prison writing classes: go home, go around your cable package, just write down the names of all the shows that have nothing to do with criminal justice. Cooking, golf, it's amazing how few are left. And this is at a time when we have the lowest crime rates in 40 years. right? I mean, this really is an obsession. And also, of course, the entire criminal justice apparatus is the third largest employer in America, all right? So important to note that we're in a different place than we were in 1970. When those experts were talking about getting rid of prisons, they were in a qualitatively different position than we are today. So it's a different project now to think about getting to a point of abolition. And when we think about those other cities, all right, I put this up and you know what we're looking at, all right? I don't have to tell you what city that is. This is a major metropolitan area with palm trees in front of it. That's got to be either Miami or LA, right? That's LA. And that, of course, is Chicago, all right? The Sears Tower, towering over Lake Michigan. But when we think about prisons, we don't think about one signature outline. We think about spaces and bodies and spaces and bodies and spaces and bodies inside spaces, all right? What we look at, in fact, is what we would call is synecdochic relationships, parts that represent the whole, all right? We think about walls, we think about bars, we think about all those different parts, but we don't think about the whole, which we would if this were geographically one continuous space, all right? However, the writing that emerges from this community makes clear that it is inhabited, it is lived, and it is experienced like a geographically continuous metropolitan area. This fourth city also has its signature concerns and issues, and has an internally consistent ethos, feel, and cohesiveness of an experience. Now, what I mean by this is that if we were to survey the citizens of New York and LA and Chicago and say, tell us what are your top 5 concerns, all right? In LA, it's going to be traffic, it's going to be way up there, and water shortages, right? Those should be there, absolutely. In Chicago, it's going to be about getting the streets clear of snow in the winter, be seeing the old people don't die in the summers, right? Because you're always hearing about those kinds of stories out of Chicago. LA is going to have its sets, right, of particular issues. And the reason I know that, in fact, the prison has its signature issues is from the process of putting the book together. So I'm going to drop back a little bit and talk about how the book came together, the editorial process in particular, and what I think that demonstrated. So in 2009, and I can talk about in the question and answer why I was motivated to put the book together in the first place. But in 2009, a research assistant and I started soliciting essays, nonfiction essays, no poetry, no fiction. We just wanted first-person witness to conditions inside prisons. The total pool from which the 71 essays in the book were collected was 154 essays, all right? And together, these illuminated the map of an archipelago city so scattered yet representative of the nation that the regions began, like neighborhoods of any city, to demonstrate their local styles, all right? California, for example, the background for every essay you read from California is about mass scale, all right? That's not true in Washington State. That's not true in Oregon, all right? It's also about sort of a complete abandonment of ideals of rehabilitation, not necessarily the case in New York, right? We've dropped our prison population by 20% over the last 15 years, all right? Too many pills, too much hostility, in a general sense that security's primary activity is to choreograph the racialized gang violence in order to thwart interracial prisoner organization. Sort of like Joan Didion meets Mike Hammer, right? But in a sea of the sons and daughters and brothers and cousins of George Jackson, right? And, of course, the largest representation of Mexican-American prisoners in any state outside of Texas, right? Texas also has that strong contingency. For New York, the writers tend to have, in terms of their style, the kind of hard-nosed sentimentality, which is typical of New Yorkers, because most people upstate are from the downstate. And if you read essays from Illinois, those prisoners tend to be chronicling a sort of penal suburbs of Chicago, all right? Because the vast majority of those folks are from Chicago. Yet across all of this work, one finds an abiding and a consistent sense of shock, expressed even among the most politically radicalized writers as they discover that the brutality behind the walls of the prison is less a result of who is locked up than of a normalized culture of prisoner abuse, humiliation, and dehumanization inside prisons committed not to correction or rehabilitation, but almost solely to meting out pain and suffering. All right. This is I've been reading and prison writing for over half a decade now, and I can tell you this is something that is particular to American prison writing. If you read Nigerian prison writing, and you know you can be mugged on the streets by the police in Lagos in broad daylight, you're not surprised that prisons are brutal, all right? But in American prison writing, this goes back to the earliest days of it in the 19th century. But you read somebody like Jack London talking about being thrown in the Penn in Erie County, and it's all about his shock that this can be taking place inside the United States. All right. From this, I drew three conclusions. One, it's a measure of a profound sense of right and wrong among convicted people. Two, the thickness of the power of the U.S. propaganda machine regarding judicial, civil, and human rights protections. And perhaps most importantly, the universality of the moral response to the institutional culture of the prison. All right? And again, this cuts across region, it cuts across class, it cuts across race. So the 154 essays themselves announce the task at hand: to select representative witness of the largest domestic metropolis ever placed under the threat of legalized violence. And when that demand joined with the desire to represent the major constituencies of the prison system by ethnicity, class, gender identification, etc., and from the greatest number of states and regions possible, and most importantly, to represent the subjects of most consistent concern among the writers themselves, then those 71 essays in the collection rose to the surface. All right. Now, I've given you a handout, and that is just a photocopy. This is a shot of the drawer, the original essay that came in. That's much larger now, which I'll talk about. And if you look through the table of contents, one thing to note is though there are a fixed number of categories of topics, they are contributed to by many different states, right, simultaneously. And in all, I came to 11 categories. So first is the life. These are sort of general introductions to what the quality of life is inside prisons. All right, there's a whole set of essays which are just about that. There's also another whole category, and I get these regularly. These are autobiographical essays about people talking about how their lives led to prison. All right. So, for example, The Shaping of a Convict by Julius Humphrey. Okay. Those are set interstitially in the first part of the book, all right, and I can talk about reasons why that is. And then Coping with Life in Prison City, another ticket in. Seeking Peace in Prison City, another ticket in. Family Life in and from Prison City, and another ticket in. And then the second part, and again, there's sort of a general subject matter for the second part, Inside Justice and Injustice. This is how basically judgment and operates inside the prison system. People who are brought up on charges for acts they've committed inside the prison, and also for crimes that prisoners see the institution having committed against them. All right. And then Kite Out. This is another whole category. And Kite Out, a kite is a prison slang for a clandestine written communication between prisoners. It's used actually more generically than that also. This is a whole set of essays, and I get them regularly. Every 10 or 15 is one of these. These are basically shouts out from prisoners to kids on the street trying to warn them away from the lives that brought them to prison. All right? And they are extremely heartfelt. They're incredibly generous. Right? And there are people who say, just don't follow in my path. And again, they're a very, very large category of those essays. Civic Dysfunction and Its Critics. Those are essays in which prisoners are critiquing policy. All right? Another, another Kite Out. Yeah, and then mental and physical health care in the prison system, another Kite Out. Community activists, these are people who are working from the inside to try to transform the system from inside, from their positions as prisoners. And then finally, prison and reentry programs, okay? So 11 categories in total. The striking thing was, of those 154, those categories were defined in the first 45 essays. And everything fell into those categories, all right? So this is not just 154 different takes on different subjects because of the particular experience of individuals. There's a whole set of signature concerns. And again, these are defined from across a whole range of states, all right? So even though different states have different policies, different attitudes, different sorts of practices, still the general experience is a unified experience, okay? So from that, this is what I want to come to the sort of statement I want to suggest is supported by that experience. Our four cities not simply bodies and spaces. It's a distinctive archipelago metropolis of human witness to the systemic and systemically experienced suffering inside America's mass incarceration complex. In its cohesiveness, prisoner, witness, At once maps the depth and breadth of the suffering we maintain as the accepted cost of legal order. It charts the most salient points in need of address in order to transform prisons into sites of restoration. And it opens to public view the anchoring institution and primary theater for the representation of legalized violence, that is, the ground in the praxis of law's authority, while sustaining readers' awareness that the suffering that underwrites that authority is the suffering of distinct individuals. And one of my motivations to put the book together was that it's clear that the prison system has become so large that it seems that only the tools of social science can get their heads around it. And humanists have really been pushed out of the game because we deal with narrative, all right? And it's a way, the metaphor of the city suggests both the size, right, just in sheer numbers, but it also suggests that this is a very particular and very distinct kind of experience experienced by individuals, all right? And the deeply interwoven national course raised among prisoners themselves can make us aware that discussion of the rule of law and law and order is virtually otherworldly. It is not the rule of law in which we operate. It's separated from awareness from a nationally cohesive institutionalization of human misery, both lived effect of and testament to the existential grounding in human pain and suffering of the current legal order. Prisoner witness alone, I believe, can point the way toward a post-carceral future. And I'm working on a monograph that's dealing with this to say that if we want to imagine a future beyond where we are in the prisons, the only people who can show us that way are the people who know exactly the depth and the breadth of the suffering that's actually being experienced there. Everybody else is speculating, right? Everybody else on the outside is speculating, okay? So this is the book. I'm going to talk about the archive, too. Where did we get to? I also want to note the proceeds that would otherwise come to me are going to go to that prison program that I organized in upstate New York, which is organized as a consortium. It basically pools the goodwill of several liberal arts colleges who donate faculty members to it. So we have an extremely low cost for that program. And my hope is that there might come a day when we have a college program, and we know this is the best way to see that people don't come back to prison, that's actually supported by the writing of other prisoners, that they can quite literally write their own ticket out, all right? Now that's the archive, that's the book. But of course, it didn't stop. We had a deadline, the deadline passed, essays continued to come in, often with cover letters saying, I know your deadline's passed, I don't even know what you're doing, but I've heard that if I send my work there, somebody will read it, all right? So these pieces came in, I had this other 83 essays in my drawer, weighing on my conscience every time I walked into my office, right? I'm like, what's going to happen with that? Happily, well, actually, I want to show you the pieces that come in, what these actually look like. And one of the important points here is just the physical body of those texts, and I'll talk about why that's important. This is two sides of a blank sheet, obviously, by James Carr. He's serving 7 concurrent life without possibility of parole sentences in Nevada for crimes in which no one died. And he's talking about why he was put in solitary confinement and his experience there. This is from Connie Gibbs. She's actually in the book. And you see a nicely word-processed essay. She's in a minimum security prison in Nebraska and talking about her concerns about re-entry outside. This is one of many, many, many sheets I have from a fellow named Willie Worley in North Carolina. Who does these beautifully rendered cartoons, basically largely about criminal offenses by staff against prisoners, particularly sexual abuse. This is from Terry Watson. This is a long autobiographical essay about how he came to prison and his experience as a black man inside the West Virginia prison system. And this is from Catherine Lynn Quick. She's also in the book. She's a pre-hormone, pre-operative male-to-female transsexual, talking about basically the chronic rape to which she is subjected by prisoners, staff, gangs of prisoners, gangs including staff, you name it, and really makes a great case that transsexual people should not be in men's prisons. All right. And these are essays. One, again, this is another fellow who sent me many, many pieces from California, Lesean Miles, Reflections from the Cement Coffin. And this is a man who's been in solitary confinement for a great number of years, and it's very clear that he's losing the distinction between waking and sleeping. That distinction is fading away for him. So he has these essays in which he is writing about waking what he remembers from his dreams, and how those things are one is infiltrating the other. And he talks about sleeping lady consciousness is this place that he goes. And interesting the fact that he's gendered it as another place. I think in some ways to sort of really make that break, right, between the two. So the work kept coming in. Happily, faculty member at Hamilton College pulled a big grant from the Mellon Foundation to do digital humanities startups. And I got on board with him, and now we're building the American Prison Writing Archive. This is a digital archive, all right? So it's not carbon-based, so potentially it can grow indefinitely. So we're now taking in everything, and one of the things that we're going to do in that archive, and we have been doing, is we actually scan the bodies of the individual essays, because that visual representation is so indicative of the conditions, as you saw already, in which people are actually living. And then every essay will be transcribed, so it'll be fully searchable. Okay. What this holds out, I believe. Well, actually, I'll talk a little bit more about how these things came in. So after the initial solicitation for the book, work kept coming in. Then we put out another round of solicitations for essays now for the archive. All right. And then in the summer of 2013, I toured 14 prisons in Northern Europe. I wrote an essay comparing European and American attitudes toward crime and punishment. That went up on the Atlantic global page, online global page. It went sort of viral. I had to hear from all kinds of folks that they'd read that essay. To my mind, most importantly, they reprinted it in Prison Legal News. And this goes out to imprisoned people. It's a journal that deals with new legislation that might impact them, legal cases that are being fought. And in addition, they put in a solicitation for the archive. Within 10 days after that was printed, our number of queries and submissions doubled. What was striking to me about that, or important to me of that, is not a matter of there only being so many writers in there. It's a matter of getting word into them that there's a place where they can send their work, and send it safely, all right? They have to fill out a questionnaire, and a questionnaire that asks them for certain kinds of information, race, gender, et cetera, so that we can create metadata, so the archive can be searchable in sort of coherent ways. But it's all voluntary, and they can write under other names, because the problem that I'm running into, and will continue to run into, is I'm trying to get work from institutions that do not want this work to come out. All right? So I'm literally trying to reach over the wall and get to these folks, and the journals like this, it turns out, and I'm just sort of fishing around to find what are the ones that get there, and this has been a really, really effective one. So with that, we have the potential, I believe, to do a sort of 21st century WPA project, all right, to literally map the penal nation, okay? And the rumor that was being crushed back in the 30s is now that misrepresentation of incarcerated people, because we could not have built this industry. The politics that created this industry would not have been possible without the acceptance of a demonization of the people who are incarcerated. And if their image changes, the whole system, its floor falls out from under it, all right? And I believe, even more strongly, or sort of personally, that it's not just a matter of humanizing those folks, but understanding, because I've seen this over and over and again, particularly people who are incarcerated for violent crimes. An individual who has committed a violent crime, who has taken a life, who is put in this institution, bears full responsibility for that, which is the great majority of people, contrary to public opinion, for that act, and spends decades in an institution in which passion plays of right and wrong are played out in front of them. You only have to document what you have seen, and you give back to us a kind of insight and wisdom that all of us on the outside really need. The men that I meet inside who have gone through that process have depths of personal insight that I don't think I will ever have to go through. I won't be in that situation. And I think we actually need what they have to tell us. So I want to show you what the archive looks like today. And again, right now, it's really just a prototype. We have 16 essays that are up. If you go to the site, and I can't tool around on the net right now, so these are just screen captures, all right? So that's the first page you'll come to. If you go down that page, you can click on the questionnaire and permission sheet, all right? So that people can pull that off, and then if they know people inside. Also, really, really important, equally important, the archive is open to everybody who works inside prisons also, all right? So corrections officers, staff, counselors, administrators, volunteers, et cetera, because we all know The people who work inside the institution are nearly as badly damaged as the people they watch over. Right? Prison guards in the United States have a life expectancy of 59. And they have it because of epidemic levels of suicide, alcoholism, and hypertension. All right? Because of the stress of that job. And the fact that they have no public face. All right? If you look at the popular media for prison staff, they stand just a step above the people they watch out for, right? They're presented as sadists and sociopaths, et cetera, and they carry that around in the world with them. I mean, interestingly, in Scandinavian prisons, what we found is that, or what I found is that they also had those low life expectancies for their guards. So as a gesture to help them, they gave them rehabilitative roles. All right, so guards have individual prisoners who they're responsible for monitoring on the way out. Now, they have more training, and they're much smaller prisons, but it also means that they have a sort of public face, probably the equivalent to what we think of as EMTs. All right, they're not doctors, they're not really highly trained, but we're all glad they're there, and we hope they do their jobs really well, all right? And they have a kind of public respect, right? And I think, and when they made that change, their life expectancies went right back up. Right? They live like other professionals, to those full lengths. And so those people are involved here too. So quickly, in the archive, you can search, even with what's there now, by the name of the institution, by the state. You can search by crime, and also any combination of these. Right? It's going to be potential for a faceted search under these categories. All right? So let's say that I want to know what African American men in maximum security prisons in Michigan are writing about. I click on Michigan, African American, maximum security, and hopefully I come up with a critical mass of essays, right, on that subject, or from those writers. To make that happen, excuse me, I'm going to go to this. To make that happen, this is going to have to be a national effort. I can't do this alone as one individual at one small liberal arts college. So I'm going to actually pass around a sign-up sheet. One of the greatest number of actual person hours and labor hours is going to be required. Every essay has to be transcribed in order to make it searchable. So we're going to set up a place where you can log in, you see the scan of the essay, and you just retype it. All right? And literally you can do this from anywhere in the world. All right? So I'm going to start that now. For anybody who's interested, there's no obligation. I'm just creating a master list of people I can be in touch with for that kind of work and what comes after that. Okay. All right. Now I have more, but I think I'm out of time. How long have I been talking?
Close up, maybe.
Okay.
Doing the timekeeping for you. But yes.
Really? Okay. Let me talk just quickly about why I put the book together originally. I started creative writing class at Attica 2006. I'd been teaching writing for 23 years. And the first thing that struck me in starting that class is that there was a man there with a master's degree, 2 who had nearly graduated from college, and all the rest had earned their GEDs inside. That is to say, they were high school dropouts. All of them had exactly the same problem in their writing. How do I keep focus? How do I keep things in line from the beginning to the middle to the end? Now, the fact that you had that much range in educational background, but everybody was having exactly the same problem, what became apparent to me quickly was that the primary influence on their writing was the traumatic effect of living inside the institution, right? Those differences came out over time, all right? Once they developed trust, once I helped them, learn ways of sort of keeping focus when you're doing a piece of writing, though they had to put that, into practice, in a place where they got noise 22 hours a day. And I became interested in whether or not that was just Attica, right, which has a bad rep. Was that an American phenomenon? So I spent a couple of summers at the Library of Congress reading all the prison writing I could get my hands on from around the world. That became the beginning of the monograph, a sort of theoretical reading of prison writing, but also I wanted to teach an undergraduate course on prison writing, and I went out to look for the texts that I would assign, right? There were individual monographs, of course, George Jackson, Eldridge Cleaver, Assata Shakur, Jack Henry Abbott, your own brilliant writer, Kenneth Hartman, and a couple of collections, H. Bruce Franklin's really valuable historical survey, right, from the 20th century. But there was not a broad-scale sampling from the current mass incarceration state of, quote, common criminals. All right, Joy James has done wonderful collections, but she focuses on prison intellectuals, all right, with a particular political focus. So my first motivation was that I just wanted to create the book that I would use in a classroom. And then also I started going to, rather than going to the MLA and literary conferences, because I'm trained as a literary critic, I started going to Law and Society and other conferences, criminology conferences and the like. A couple of things I noticed. One, you folks go to better places than we do. More interesting cities, you dress better, you got more money because we're humanists. But the other thing was that I was still, even at those conferences, I was not hearing a lot of work based in the writing of incarcerated people. So that suggested to me there really was no text. It was not my failure to find it. All right. So those are the motivations. But those are the motivations to start the project. And then the essays came in. And once the essays came in and I read them, right, then my motivations changed radically. The book could serve all those purposes, those academic purposes, right? But it became the purpose that I outlined at the beginning of the talk, right? That to really open up this institution and to transform the public image of who these folks are and to impress upon us exactly how necessary their input is if we are going to change the system in a way that is not another failed experiment, right? And if there's anything that I find incarcerated people will tell you over and over again, only incarcerated people know what needs to be done in order to make this system better. And they are sick and tired of experts coming from the outside and telling them how to transform it. And those programs are not always very successful, right? Because they don't know how the prison system works. I'll stop there.
So I next want to introduce my colleague, Hilden. She is Professor Emerita of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. This semester I have the great pleasure of co-teaching with her, along with Victoria Robinson and Jill Stoner, a big ideas course on prison. Since meeting Pat several years ago, I feel like I've gotten a whole second education about mass incarceration, one much more grounded in connections to the real experts, prisoners, because Pat had managed to find far more prisoners on this campus than I ever knew existed and become deeply involved in their lives and struggles as students. And I have just benefited enormously from my work with Pat, and I'm anxious to have you hear from her as well. So Pat.
I'll try to be really fast. Thank you for a wonderful talk, first of all, because I wish our whole class had been here. In fact, they really need to hear it. And I guess it's recorded now, so they can possibly hear it. And also thank you to Jonathan Simon for inviting me to be part of this. And I'm going to go really fast, because I know all of you have things that you want to ask and talk about. I want to thank, first of all, Doran Larson for shaping this work so that the voices of the imprisoned men and women are loudly heard without what is sometimes expected intervention by the editing academic to explain what various writers are saying. Professor Larson starts the book making his intention clear to use these writings to break a quarantine and pull back the veil that has allowed us to ignore the violent dysfunction inside American prisons and its cause, quote, less the effect of whom we lock up than of institutionalized practices veiled by the sanctions of law. Throughout, I found the framing both helpful and discreet, and I want to suggest that this is a model for the ways we, who are not inhabitants of the fourth city, should engage with the people who live there or who come from there. In parentheses, I'd like to add that I liked the link implied, though perhaps unconsciously, between this fourth city and the fourth world, that indigenous people, per capita the most incarcerated community in the United States, used to describe their world as distinct from the post-colonial third world, since they haven't left. Thus, calling this prison world and designating it as a world, the fourth city, links it both to its presence amongst urban populations and to the indigenous world. I also want to note that this book, by the editor's careful discretion, underscores a problem that must concern all of us who work in this area of critical prison studies. There is a fine line walked between those outside who are genuinely engaged with abolishing imprisonment or studying the problems of mass incarceration in various ways, and those who succumb to what seems to me to be a kind of awful voyeurism, tour groups to look at imprisoned people, a voyeurism that, as Stephen Sifra, who's one of our formerly incarcerated students who isn't here today because of the student strike, called said to me once, either romanticizes imprisoned people or sees them as the worst of the worst. Native Americans know this kind of stuff all our lives. People want us to represent something they believe, whether extreme savagery or romanticized essential Indianness. For imprisoned people, the voyeur, the collector, the well-meaning reformer, read Kenneth Hartman before you venture thither, all pose certain kinds of problems. For imprisoned people, the least of them, the disrespect they are made to feel by the behaviors of the voyeurs. This kind of voyeurism just recreates all the horrors of the Wild West shows, the Our Spanish Heritage fiestas, or the Indian dioramas of another day, and it perpetuates the widespread tendency to view them as not us. I think Professor Larson has walked this line and succeeded in not falling into any of the many traps. 2, I can suggest that if you are not now a prison abolitionist, that is, someone who works to abolish imprisonment as a form of punishment, you might well be after you read this book. In addition to finding testimony about the torture that pervades our prisons, the constant random humiliation, the overt and covert torture, which includes physical violence, not least on women's bodies, the medical neglect and mental torture of the most refined kinds, you will have the opportunity to see the guards and wardens and counselors and psychologists and others who are employed inside to do this work. Imprisoned people who are disabled, or those who stand out to the guards, including gays and transsexuals, come in for refined humiliations, as several writers in this collection attest. When I tell people about my experiences with the guards, which are, with one single exception, nasty, they tell me that I must be exaggerating, that they have known someone who worked in prison who was a nice fellow, or a nice woman, or whatever. And of course, when I was a volunteer teacher in the federal system in Arizona for several years, I found that the wardens and guards generally treated me as a kind of helper, often thanking me for making their jobs easier and such. Of course, they had no idea what I was thinking behind my face, but I had to suck it up in order to continue to do the work. But as a friend of one young man, Raphael Cacique, who has been in the SHU at Pelican Bay for 8 horrible years now, introduced to me by his brother, Dr. Francisco Cacique, his younger brother and a recent Cal PhD, as well as a visitor to another friend in Denver and now in Nevada, I've learned all about random humiliation and the weird power problems the guards, men and women, and often the women are the worst, that characterize every single interaction. That I'm not exaggerating is surely satisfactorily supported by almost every single writer in this collection. Recently, after a day of legislative hearings prompted by the hunger strikes of SHU prisoners in Pelican Bay, Corcoran, and Tehachapi in 2011 and 2013, Lonnie Hancock, who represents our area in the state legislature, concluded that guards, quote, probably needed better training. That this will have little, if any, effect is, I think, made quite clear in this collection. Most writers here would simply note that those addicted to meanness, violence, and humiliation, addicted to power, are not likely to retrain into rehabilitation guards. But I do see that the Scandinavian project might be something that would work in some cases, and I think it's really interesting to hear about. 3, much of the book also underscores an argument many of us have been making for a long time, and which Professor Larson has made as well. Without the myriad practices and mechanisms of racism, mass incarceration would not be possible. From the earliest days of the invasion and conquest of North America, incarceration has been a major tool brought by Europeans and deployed to control unwanted populations who in those days were both native and African. Since then, any non-white population has joined the roles of those chosen for carceral regimentation. This collection demonstrates how the whole corrupt, destructive system of contemporary incarceration depends heavily on racism, not least to keep those highly profitable beds filled up and the guards union raking in the money with which they buy our politicians. How it is deployed to humiliate all imprisoned people is shown clearly in A. Whitfield's piece, JCF Welcome, where he recounts the arrival of a very young Asian American kid And he says that the guards not only used racial epithets to humiliate him, but also lined up a bunch of older, seasoned men, all shackled and standing silent, to watch, so that their inability to respond in any human fashion would humiliate them too. For the words of women in this collection are horrifying and clarify for readers the arguably worse situations of imprisoned women, subjected to both rape and other forms of sexual violence, and the distorted logic that encourage imprisoned women to sell their sexuality in return for those ordinary things, sanitary napkins, for example, which are not supplied regularly, that we women on the outside mostly take for granted. And as for the children, Jane Dorotich's pieces about imprisoned women are particularly horrible and illustrative of the twisted logics and inhumanity that characterize our system of incarceration. And finally, both the intelligence and the humanity of the writers, as well as the moments when a shared racialized world transcends guard-inmate divisions, shine through all the essays, even the ones that are most heartbreaking. Like Professor Larson, I've met some of the most remarkable people I ever met in prison, and our formerly incarcerated students are an amazing group of people, as my colleagues, Dr. Robinson and Professor Simon, will both agree, I know. One writer, Jarvis J. Masters, puts it this way: my grandmama used to always say, it's not what you are, it's who you are and what you have to live with inside yourself. Masters is the author of the most touching piece I found in here, in fact, The Inmate and the Prison Guard, which recounts the night in San Quentin when he and the guard he has known for 25 years joined together in their mutual joy that Obama has been elected president. The guard shares with Masters his 96-year-old grandmother's 4 a.m. call to him from Mississippi. She told him, now you listen, do you know I'm alive? I'm alive. He's alive to see this day, to see we get us a black president of this here country, to see one of us get that far. The answered prayer for this, our peoples. I'm just so happy I'm about to die. And Masters notes, together we had stepped beyond our prison walls. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to say much more so that we can get into our discussion, but I do want to just pick up on the metaphor of this book, of the fourth city, and one of the reasons that it so excites me is that in my own life, having been born in the late 50s and sort of come into studying law and criminology in the 70s and 80s, the mass incarceration story has taken place in the background of a broader story, the crisis of American cities, really the disinvestment of American cities. And when you talk about the fourth city, for somebody of my generation, it immediately brings Detroit to mind, because for the longest time Detroit was the fourth largest city in the United States. And just as Detroit today is often castigated as sort of responsible for the horrible blight and the often really savage conditions that people live with there, as if it was a responsibility of their choices, etc. There's a kind of reflection between those emptied cities and these filled cities that have been constructed around the country. And one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about this current moment is that doubts about mass incarceration are coming in at a moment when I think a generation, some of whom are in this room, who are coming into adulthood now, some of whom have grown up in those high-security suburbs that have been built for the free among us in this carceral geography, are sick of that and want to return to cities, want to live in more diverse, more exciting, more heterogeneous communities. And, of course, fear of crime is a big block to that. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is that, like Doran, I think that the formerly incarcerated and the currently incarcerated are actually an enormous resource as urban America tries to figure out viable urban patterns. These folks know how to live with conflict around them, with threat around them, and actually keep the peace a great deal of the time, and they are an enormous resource. The source of my concern and my fear is that as those suburban offspring come back to the cities, their fear of crime, their assumptions, their racialized assumptions about what crime is, how it's generated, may generate a kind of new forms of social control that are beginning to be described by geographers and criminologists like Catherine Beckett and Stephen Herbert in their book Banish, the exclusion of people from urban space. So you may not, and the irony may be that instead of a fourth city, we'll have people who are sort of scattered within our own cities, but now locked down in ways through technology and territorial policing that may make the solidarities of prison look something like we're nostalgic for. With that a bleaker note, I meant to end on a more optimistic note, because I do think that turning to this tremendous resource as we begin to think about what a more legitimate public safety model would be is a reason to be optimistic. Let me bring Doran back up here, since he's good at, I think he'd be as effective as anyone at calling on his own questions.
Sure.
So without further ado, please.
Yeah.
Well, I just, congratulations for this piece of work and continuing. And I also really think it's important that next stage you're planning to do, which is to collect the stories also of the workers in the correctional system. I think that's really important. You walk a very delicate line between demonizing and not that workforce and understanding that. The things that I guess I want to ask you about is that. A preface was saying that for 3 years I was a court-appointed overseer of conflicts and mediations that occurred inside the correctional system, and I took that position with a great deal of foreboding. And what became most important for me was that the incarcerated population in the state found me, and I received almost on a daily basis letters from them similar to the stories that you tell. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of my own story work is that moment in which we create the categories in which the stories are organized, in and around the stories are organized. Mm-hmm. And I find that to be the kind of work that you and I do and others in this room do, that's a really challenging moment. And given the purpose that you've articulated, I guess I still wonder whether the categories that you have constructed, which are true to the kinds of categories that I can imagine when I was reading through stories by the dozens, are really the ones that you want to embrace fully. And that, let me just give you an example. One of my undergraduate honors students, did her research on how, despite all of the efforts to divide the incarcerated population, how incarcerated people form productive social relationships with one another. It seems to me a part of our task in doing this is to develop categories that are true to the stories, but that also might help the political effort that we're talking about, whether these categories really capture what might be the most important thing to overwhelming the way that population is constructed to the general public.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have to say, my focus, whether it was well executed or not, was essentially to create a conversation between the writers that I had on hand, right, to work with, and this was all done with very close conversation with student readers who were very good readers. I only work with RAs who've taken my prison writing class, who've been to Attica or one of the other prisons and talked to prisoners, my worry all the way through was literally to reify these categories, right? It's like just another bunch of slots that people are being dropped into. It's literally as though it's kind of Foucault from the ground up, right? Like they define the categories, but in some sense I created those. On the other hand, putting together 71 essays that were just 71 essays in alphabetical order was not going to do what I wanted to do in terms of effect on a larger public. So I guess in some what I would say is that this is a first phase of this effort, right? But the archive doesn't do any categorizing, right? It categorizes, you do your own search, all right? You choose what it is you want to understand about the system, and you go through that, right? You can go through just out of personal interest and say, I just want to read about how gay and lesbian people are dealing and transsexual people are dealing with being in prison. And you can find all those, all right, and see what sort of conversations they've had. In terms of just more specifically, the idea of those close bonds that individuals create inside, those are sort of written through virtually every essay here, right? It is part of how people survive inside. And the, one of the many sort of revelations to me in working with incarcerated people is how complex their social networks are. Those are absolutely crucial for their survival, right? You either, in a very violent prison, which is not all, but most in sort of the general, sort of white noise of prison institutions, you are either so formidable that nobody messes around with you, or you are connected to other people, all right? Danner Darklight has the first and the closing essay because he's just a brilliant writer, right? He would pass me, copies of his essays, his diaries. Most of them are about maintaining social relationships. Who owes me what? Who owes me how? If someone is feeling badly, I'm going to go check in with him today, et cetera, et cetera. They're really complex relationships, and I think that popular culture represents a bunch of people sitting in cells and sharpening things, right? And that's all they do, right? And many of the people, who my guys in my class say, I do this because it's better than sitting around sharpening things, right? Because otherwise, that's that's what you're going to end up doing. So there is some artifice. There can't not be artifice in the creation of those categories. But again, as far as possible, I tried to create those. Now, I'll point to a place where there absolutely was intervention and artifice there. When I put the section, or a couple places, the section on family life in and from Prison City, about how do people carry on family relations, I had no essays from incarcerated mothers. And there was no way I was going to go to print without any essays by incarcerated mothers, because this is one of the major problems, and certainly its residual effects, one of the worst problems we have. So I contacted the California Coalition for Women Prisoners here in the Bay Area. I knew they had a newsletter, which I've been reading, and I knew there were essays such as that, and they directed me to electronic archive, and I found really 3 beautiful essays on that topic to top that. So I actually went and looked for something to fill in that section. Also, those other 2 categories that are done interstitially. The reason they're done interstitially is for 2 reasons. One, there was no place where they really fit. And also, if you line up all the autobiographies of how people got to prison, those are a bunch of really sad stories about people who seem to be unable to make anything but bad decisions, right? I mean, they're telling their stories, right? Stephen Ainsworth is like a lesson in stupidity. The one thing I can offer the world is all the dumb decisions I made and all the chances that I blew. But you line those up for 7 or 8, and you're going to reconfirm all, of the public images of prisoners, or the worst of them. So putting them interstitially as a sort of break between those sections, right? Again, it was artifice on my part, but it was a way to get that category in, because I couldn't deny it, because it was a big stack of essays working in that area. And then the Kites Out, similarly. That would have looked more like, I think, advocacy on my part, to say all these people want to do is try to help other people. And there's a basic sort of generosity, I think, in every one of these writers, because they write at their risk, right? They don't write without risk. If the CEO, who's the captain on your gallery, knows you're writing about what's going on, life's going to get very difficult, whether or not you got First Amendment rights, protections or not. All right. So absolutely, there was intervention, but again, as little as was possible to do.
Yeah. I'm Jay Borchard. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Michigan and visiting scholar here at Berkeley at the Center for the Study of Law and Society. But perhaps more importantly for this conversation, I'm also somebody who's a former prisoner who spent 7 years incarcerated in California and Minnesota and 13 different prisons in Illinois. And so I wanted to address my experience versus some of the things that you said in the talk.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that you mentioned is the statistic about the number of people who are currently incarcerated and the number of people who are also under custodial supervision now, like parole and probation. Mm-hmm. I think that's really a severe underestimation of it, with who lives with the consequences of a criminal record at this point in time. So I won't say every moment of every day, but every day, like when I see the police or what I automatically realize that I am the most easily accessible suspect in the general vicinity because of my arrest record. Mm-hmm. And so I have to gauge, especially in Oakland, in California, with all the weed and everything all over the place. I mean, I'm going to be the one that goes to jail first because I'm the easiest one to convict. So I think that there are millions of people like me. And because there are millions of people like me, there are also many more, I think, white people who actually do know somebody who's been incarcerated, particularly in places like Georgia, which is such a police state, even an outlier among all the states that are police states. Mm-hmm. The other point is about the transsexual prisoner that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And as somebody who spent a year and a half in K6G, segregated by my sexual orientation, I think we need to be very careful about suggesting the way people are placed based on sexual or gender identities, because to me, the problem is rape culture and a culture of violence, and not necessarily how people are housed. And when people are housed in those ways, that type of housing classification is oftentimes separated from access to resources that have been proven to be helpful for mental health and well-being and preparation for release into society, things like education and employment and other programming, incarceration. It's really easy for the prisons to set up a legitimate penological interest to not then bring those segregated prisoners to these resources.
Right.
So that's a careful, I think, discussion that we need to have. I guess the last point that I want to make is spending so much time in Chicago and Illinois in general and incarcerated, I was well aware of just how bogus prison was going to be. I mean, the Chicago police are notorious for being just out of control. And I have many, many stories. While you were talking, I wrote just a list of stories that I could contribute to this website. Some funny, some horrible, some in between. But I was wondering if you saw in some of your letters from people who came from places that have notoriously corrupt police forces, places like Louisiana or Chicago or New York, that these prisoners were perhaps well prepared and well aware of the randomness and the brutality that is part of the prison experience.
Thanks for your input. That's all those things really. Let me sort of take those in order. Absolutely, the numbers that we can document people who are currently under custodial supervision is just too small, right? In terms of, and Michelle Alexander documents this, for basically young black men without education, as does Bruce Western and others. But there's a whole sort of rings and rings of repercussions for that. And again, that's what I hope the archive would make apparent, because you'd be a great contributor to that archive. Second, about the separate housing, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying that just segregation of some sort is what will fix this. I'm just saying what's happening now isn't working, right? And again, it is part of that the rape culture, right, that exists. And interestingly, I'll just give you one anecdote from Attica, which I thought was really interesting. I had two men in my writing class who married, right? Because in New York State, you can marry. One actually changed his name. And they clearly had a very mutual and very supportive and very nurturing relationship. The guards whenever those guys were in my class, they would walk by and look by the window. They never came by to look what was going on in my class, except when those two guys were in class, all right? Because they didn't want to see them touching each other. And what became my reading of that is that sex as an act of power, they understood and they know that it goes on, but mutual and supported love, they did not want to see that happening. And they literally put them in different parts of the prison. They're legally married, but they never cross paths anymore, right? And I think eventually they booted one guy out. They just sent him someplace else, which they do. So they're legally married, but will never see each other for whatever time they're there. So there are all kinds of problems, even in the state where you recognize, marriage equality, in the actual institutions there. And the what was the last part? The last question you had? I'm sorry.
The part about people coming from areas that are notoriously corrupt.
Still, when people are writing about the institution, because I get a lot of essays from people who were, born and raised, south side of Chicago or East LA or other places. And they talked about the experience they had with the police outside. But somehow, I think there is still this sense with those writers, at least they convey this in their work, that somehow there's going to be some kind of rationality, and there's going to be some sort of oversight once they go inside the institutions. Now, interestingly, and this is a whole other field of study, county jails versus prisons. And many people will say, if you can survive the county jail, prison's going to be a lot easier, right? You don't want to be in the LA County Jail. You do not want to be in Rikers Island, right? You do not want to be in the Cook County Jail. So I think part of that is kind of that acculturation, right, too. But it continues to be the case. And again, historically, it's absolutely built into, it's peculiar to American prison writing, right? And I'm not sure, that may, I don't know if that will change in time, but I've virtually not seen an essay, right, that is not in its essence trying to inform people on the outside. This is not what you think it is. And not with the idea that this is not what you think it is by watching popular culture. I'll say that there's no popular representation that has anything to do with what actually goes on inside, right? But there was still a belief somehow, right, that there would be some sort of protections against staff committing crimes against incarcerated people. Now, the other thing that, and Michael Machino can speak to this, even more directly than I can, because you've done great work on the fact that just professionalizing really leads to people just being even more happier with their jobs, unless you change what they do, right, and their responsibilities inside, is that in some sense, there's parts of the prison population which are very violent, and they are causing, a lot of trouble in the institution, but they are part of the population. And within CO culture, there's also a part, right? Literally 2 weeks ago, 2 Mondays ago, I was in Attica. They doubled my call out, suddenly my class doubled in size one night. And this guy was saying, usually on any shift, it's 3 guys, 3 COs. Everybody else just wants to get through their shift. They just want to be peaceful. And there's 3 guys who will say, if that guy is on staff, some prisoner is going to attack a guard, right? Because that's how they write it up, right? If they decide that they are going to assault an inmate, all right? So it is that, that small group, but it pervades the culture. And there's also, a culture, of course, of tolerance for that. Because in the same way that prisoners don't snitch on each other, COs don't snitch on each other also. They maintain, and part of that, I think a big part of that, is the fact that we so disproportion staff to prisoners, which is not the case in other Western countries, that there's a constant siege mentality, right? If you got a 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 ratio, you have to maintain a culture of intimidation in order to feel safe, right? As opposed to, I saw prisons in Denmark. The total prison population is 20. Now these are transitional, right? These are all on the way out. And the staff was 13, right? People are going out, they're working, they're going, getting education, they're coming back, they're about to leave. But even the big prisons, quote, a big prison in Scandinavia is 400, right? And the culture there is just completely different. They have steel darts, they have, pool, just the objects they have inside there. We would never get past the gate, even in a minimum security prison in America, which suggests there's a whole other culture, a different kind of internal culture there. Yeah, yeah,
I feel this is an unfair question, given you told us it's a very nascent project and it's growing, but given the slippage in growth and the kind of symbiotic relationship between immigration detention and the carceral system, and that's becoming such an increasing presence in American life in terms of incarceration, would you feel that this is a project that will extend to the idea of writings that are being done in extended immigration detention facilities at the moment?
Yeah.
The second question would be, in the course of the writings, in the process of the writings, are needs of people being expressed, and if they are, in terms of legal rights, hormone treatment, kinds of questions about their rights and responsibilities, and if they are, how do you deal with those? Because they're obviously not necessarily in some ways the context of the writing project, but you are this very unique communication point.
Yeah. And I get a lot of letters, people who they've heard about the archive, and they're saying, help me fight my case, right? I'm not the ACLU. I can't do this. So I would literally direct them. I'll find the local branch of whatever organization is working for their rights and direct them there, because that's not what I can do. This is the idea, would sort of include detention. What I'm really trying to do is doing this project has my hands completely full, all right? And what I see it as a model for others, all right? So if I would love to see someone work on electronic archive for formerly incarcerated people, telling the stories of the difficulty of reentry, right? But right now, just in terms of the subject matter that I have, it's enough, and I can't do that mixing yet, right? But again, and talking to prison workers, administrators in Europe, they're very interested in this idea, right? And using this as a model for their creating archives also. So yeah, absolutely. And I'm not an expert on detention or immigration or those sorts of issues, but certainly anybody who wanted to start that kind of archive or collection, I would put all the resources I have, at their disposal to try to figure out how to create that. Yeah.
I just want to echo others in thanking you for doing this work, which is so absolutely important. And one of the things that I really like in the way you frame it is to acknowledge the importance of the workers in the prison system as well as the incarcerated people. And you probably know, but I just want to mention Amy Lemon's work, which was actually done in California, where she did research in the prisons in California and using a very sophisticated statistical method, really identified the toxic transformative nature of prisons on prison workers, on correctional officers, using a sort of a quasi-random assignment. It doesn't matter, but anyway. Very important work, it's published, it's out there, and it really speaks to the impact of the institution itself on individuals who are in it.
Yeah.
And that might, I'm just interested if that's part of the, I mean, the prison, the other question, I guess I had a very practical question, which is, are you going to actually link to the books that are also written by prisoners, especially in the contemporary period? Because there are, obviously, as you know, books that are published by prisoners, and at least having that as a kind of side bibliography.
Yeah. I mean, I hope with the archive, when it, and again, it's still under construction, virtually in terms of figuring out technologically how we're going to make it work, that it would be a sort of, one-stop directory for prisoner support organizations, for other books that, that people can read, et cetera, et cetera. And that the issue, I mean, I come to that process of that acculturation anecdotally through what prisoners write, and also I happen to know a number of people who are the sons or daughters of prison guards, and every one of them has the same story. This is a great guy, and then 2 or 3 years down the road, we all felt like we were living in prison, the kids at home, because you carry that home, right? You can go in with, everything balanced and wanting to do a good job, and the ethos of the institution, again, because I think of that siege mentality that's there, and also, as a couple of studies show, the sort of programmed polarization when you have inner city people of color going to rural prisons. New York is sort of textbook for this, and you have the sons and daughters of the white working poor who have never had close contact with inner city people before, and inner city people who have not had contact, with upstate white folks. And where do they meet? They meet in uniforms, right? And in a situation in which you have people, both sides of that sort of, I see this as sort of the front line of a racial civil war that's taking place in the U.S. And the hot front of that is the confrontation between prison guards and prisoners, all right? And everyone's dying in the course of that. And the confrontation itself is confirming all of the worst ideas that those two cultures bring into that moment, all right? And again, corrections officer stories, that is the great untold story of the prison system. There's just no literature out there. Kelsey Kaufman's book, Prison Officers in Their World, it was a good insider's story of that, New Jack, right? But the fact that you can name all those titles, basically one hand, is remarkable, given the enormous, the fact that prison staff are one of the 2 largest categories of all state employees. One is college university professors, and the others are prison guards, right? So these are folks who are a big part, of a salaried state apparatus, and we don't know what their stories are. But they know they're dying young, right? They know that. I mean, if you talk to somebody who's the shop steward for the union, they will say, our people are dying.
Yeah.
Right.
Just as a side note, Amy was able to work with the Correctional Officers Union, and they were very happy to field the surveys, and I mean, she had unprecedented access. I mean, they were very interested in having that experience better understood.
Part of the problem there is just a political polarization between people who are activists, right? Abolitionists, for example, activists who are prisoners, and Jody Lewin, has talked about this publicly. It's like, well, you're having a problem with the guards, go to their union. Go to their union meeting, talk to them. And she had, was talking to people who are in the abolitionist movement, saying, would you like to meet some of these folks? And they say, politically, I can't do that, right? They are the other. We can't converse with them, right? So it's built in politically, into the apparatuses trying to change these systems, as well as, in the institution itself, right? So it's really a problem.
One more question, maybe.
Sure.
One more.
Yeah. Yes, this is wonderful work. Thank you for doing it. I'm currently teaching the the sociology course over at San Quentin. And I would love to just Xerox this page so they know how to get in touch with you.
Please
my
do.
students. You said you had your hands full, but you're still looking for.
Oh, absolutely.
as
Yeah.
long as you can,
Yeah.
Right?
Right now, we're just like, I just
You
want
can
everything. I just
distribute
want
these
everything.
in all the courses, or the college Jody Lewin's out.
Right. Right.
And
And San Quentin, I mean, if there's a single prison that has a
great.
great literary history in America, it is San Quentin.
Yeah.
The number of great novels that have come out of, Malcolm Braley.
About the archive project, so it's going to be really.
Yeah, and that's, and again, that's the challenge, is just getting the word out there. Because if I were to send this to, every prison superintendent in America,
Right.
they would just put me on their hit list. They wouldn't say, yeah, let's pass it on. Let's shut down this thing.
They don't have
as possible.
access to the web, so they'll
Right.
write you.
But there is I'm not sure
Yes,
if that
it is
version,
on here.
it's got the mailing address, right.
And the other thing is that I've just finished writing a book in which we interview large numbers of prisoners in California, as well as correctional officers. And so we do get their side of the story into the book. And one of the things that one of these officers said to us that is indicative, I think, both of the embarrassment that this woman has about what she does, and also her disdain for the people she's holding. When we asked, she just volunteered actually. She said when she's out and about on an airplane or someplace and people ask her what she does, she tells them she's in human waste management.
Oh my God.
Because she doesn't want to say who she is, what she does, and this is the way she sees her job.
Right. Yeah.
And
Which
she-
is both the way of looking at herself,
Yes.
as well as a way of looking at the people that are
Yeah.
there. Whether or not she codes it that way.
Right.
I think.
And we
is
said, oh, really? We thought that meant sewers. And she says, human sewers. And this was like you said, ostensibly perfectly nice person.
Right.
So,
I just want to mention one point because we're out of time now.
Go ahead and mention it.
Is that, as I'm sure some of you know, the prison population has actually started to sink. The last 3 years, it's going off a bit. Very happily, I'm very glad to say that. The people who are the sort of highest profile leaders in that movement are Newt Gingrich and Rand Paul and Grover Norquist. All right, and it's all a dollars and cents issue. It's just dollars and cents. Taxpayers are doing too much, so they're willing to look at the front end. How do we sentence? At the back end, how do you transition people out? They do not want to look at what goes on set, because then they have to sort of backpedal against all that demonization that they built their political careers on, from the 70s to the 80s. This is one of the reasons I think it's particularly crucial to build this archive, because the other great witness literatures that we know of slavery and Holocaust and the Native genocide, they all ended with wars. But they all ended with a collective shock effect that made us stop and look at what we've done. If this thing ends by slow attrition, the next time we're feeling rich and vengeful, it'll just build back up. So we need this record of exactly how much pain and suffering it meted out, upon citizens and upon the society as a whole, in order to sort of put a kind of block there, so we'll go instead of going back.
Well, on that note of urgency, let me bring this to a close by pointing out that we have copies of the book right here behind us, thanks to our friends at University Press Books. So join me in thanking Doran Larson for engaging in this.